And so he eventually got his money back. But anyways, it just shows that in the 20s, you do have some people, and you have your famous lawyers. On the left, you had Clarence Darrow, and on the right, we got Williams Jennings Bryan. I don't know if you remember him, but from the 1896 election. So you got, but it just shows you that conflict in the 20s between religion, between science. There's a lot of conflicts in the 20s. There's religion and science, there's diversity and not diversity, there's black versus white, there's all kinds of stuff. Meanwhile, the economy is doing very, very well. If you're very wealthy, I must say. Another aspect of the 20s is this, my thing, prohibition. Also known as the Noble Experiment, a noble experiment which radically failed. Now, in the 18th Amendment, the United States voted in the 18th Amendment to become what you call dry. Now, of course, you guys know this. Is that going to mean that Americans are going to be like, okay, cool. We're done with hooch, which is basically a name in the 1920s for alcohol. We're done with the giggle water. That's another word they use. We're done. No problem. No, heck no. It just means that a new lucrative trade is going to erupt, kind of like what happens today with illegal drugs, as you could say. Now, the 18th Amendment was one part of the legislation that was passed. But this act, called the Volstead Act, actually gave the government the power to enforce the law. And what the government had to do to enforce the law is they had to actually have people to enforce the law. Because in many, many cities, the police didn't really enforce the law. And they didn't want to enforce the law because they were a part of the business too. Policemen wanted to drink. And in big cities like Chicago and New York, you often had, police officers that you kind of developed relationships with. If you were drinking this stuff, that wouldn't bust you. People you're cool with, you know what I mean? And maybe people you could hook up with a little bit of extra hooch here and there. And so what the government had to do is they had to create FBI agents to actually go and bust people. And that's what the Volstead Act did. The most famous FBI group would be the Untouchables, which is headed up by a guy named Eliot Ness, who basically, they're called Untouchables because the idea was they couldn't be bribed. Because a lot of the times in the illegal sale of alcohol, folks would be bribed, and gangsters would do the bribing. The most famous gangster being Mr. Scarface here, and that's Al Capone. Al Capone was operating out of Chicago, and what he was interested in is just making money. And that's how, and he created a whole illegal sale of alcohol and in order to make a lot of money. Of course, Al Capone, one of the reasons he was so successful is because he paid off the mayor. He paid off the police. He gave them what they wanted, which is money. And so there's a lot of corruption going on. But it's kind of like when you look at this and you look at what's going on in America today, is it a good idea to make drugs or certain things illegal? I don't know the answer to that. I have some personal opinions on this. My personal opinion, I'll just tell you, marijuana, depending, I mean, there's been studies that have shown that if we do make it legal in California, okay, don't get the wrong idea here. I'm not interested in any of that. I'm just economically speaking. So don't be, no. Economically speaking, if they were to actually make marijuana legal in the state of California, some studies have shown that it would generate, in terms of tax money, an extra $8 million a year, just by the regulation and sale of it. just by taxing it.
Not counting side businesses.
Not counting any of that. I'm just saying, like, if you were to sell it in a store somehow and tax it, it would generate oodles and oodles of money. Now that's just money though. I mean, the social effects of this, not sure. But economically speaking, as a taxpayer, I'm like, okay, that sounds okay. I'm not saying that, again, that I would enjoy doing it. I'm just saying. It works in some other countries. So got you guys wondering now. Of course, gang warfare erupted, and this might be a reason for legalizing stuff like marijuana. You know, look at Mexico, and there's a lot of drug wars and drug cartels. I mean, if you take the money out of it, it's possible that it might lead to a stable society. Prohibition ended right when basically the Great Depression started. Because what the politicians finally understood is that it wasn't working at all. It never worked, and it was never going to work. All it did was it created conflicts between, the FBI and gangsters, and you had a war in the streets, basically. So I don't know if you can equate this with what's going on now in America, but it's fairly close in terms of thinking behind that. Again, from a monetary standpoint, that's all I'm saying. Yes. All right. Other ethnic groups in the 1920s and other things that are happening. In the 20s, you also have, in terms of kind of over here in the western part of the United States, so African Americans are kind of changing things a lot for themselves. You have immigrants. You also have out here on the West Coast, Mexican immigration. For example, here's an interesting statistic here. Between 1910 and 1930, the number of Mexican immigrants counted by the U.S. Census triples from 200 to 600,000. And where are Mexicans going? They're primarily coming to California, they're in Texas, they're coming into New Mexico, Arizona, to try to get jobs, basically. As you know, while we're fighting World War I, they're having a revolution. So socially speaking, it's not just black and white here. We're talking about lots of different ethnic groups, and in this case, many Mexican immigrants coming to the United States as well. And so again, diversity. It's just kind of interesting too. Mexicans coming to the United States, as well as African Americans, and the research is still coming out on this that we're learning. We know that African Americans faced tons of discrimination and tons of lynching, so to speak, hanging from trees and vigilante violence against them in the 1910s and the 1920s. But we know now that Mexicans also experienced that at the hands of whites in the Southwest United States. And we also know that when Mexican immigrants started to come back into the United States, California and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona also had similar laws to what we have in the South, with Jim Crow laws for blacks in the South. For example, in many public school systems inside California, for example, it was illegal to speak Spanish in the school. And if you were caught speaking Spanish, you would be paddled in front of a classroom in some school districts, meaning that you would be basically, I'll find another power source. You would be paddled, which means you would be whacked in front of the classroom just for speaking Spanish. Even in California, and we like to think of ourselves as a pretty progressive state. I mean, California used to be part of Mexico, for crying out loud. But there were actually anti-marriage laws that prohibited white people from marrying Hispanic people. So not a lot of people know that because we like to think of our area of the United States as a little bit more progressive and a little bit more like, okay, we didn't have segregation here. No. But they had white-only restaurants, they had Mexican-only restaurants, they had, it's the same kind of thing. Just some examples of some things that Mexican Americans did. Here in California especially, as you guys probably know, Mexican Americans, these are pictures of some Punjabi Sikhs back in the day, Mexican Americans marrying them and so on and so forth. So in terms of the politics, number one, return to normalcy. Basically trying to get back to restoring some semblance of what it means to be America again. The war years were pretty crazy in a lot of ways. There was a sense among many whites that too many immigrants were coming in. America is becoming too diverse. Need to get back to normal. So the politicians of the 1920s are very much into that mode of thought. We have an expanding economy, so what we have to do is we have to have a government that basically promotes a laissez-faire type of ideology. And that's the way the government is going to be. Like, for example, in the early 1920s, one of the secretaries of the Treasury, his name is Andrew Mellon, M-E-L-L-O-N, kind of like Waterman, I guess you could say. Andrew Mellon basically says this, he's like, hey, let's cut the taxes on the wealthy. Okay, 16th Amendment says we have to have income taxes, we're going to cut the taxes. And what happens as a result, that's why millionaires grow. That's why on the outside, America is doing very, very well. So the government pretty much tries to pursue that kind of economic system. Also, isolationism, as I said before, America wants to feel as though they shouldn't get involved with other nations. We need to be focused in on ourselves and not get into treaties and so on and so forth. And in the 1920s, that seems to be the mode that the Republicans are in. Now, is that the mode the Republicans are in now? Are Republicans isolationists? Oh, no, they're not. No. Some are, depending on the politician. Rand Paul is kind of like, let's not be involved, but John McCain is like, if there's a problem in Syria, let's get involved with that. Even Democrats are too. Democrats are very much interventionists. So, in some ways. So kind of this idea that's very different today, foreign to us as Republicans are to be back then. And also another key idea in terms of politics is this fear of enemies, both internally and externally. And I'm specifically talking about the fear of alien ideas. Okay, don't freak out, we're not talking about real aliens. We're talking about communism, we're talking about socialism, we're talking about anarchism. That kind of stuff is very much feared. In a lot of ways, this is an era of fear, of different people, of different ideologies, of different this, of different that. One example of that, and let me get to this, one example of that in the 1920s, and I was going to show this video clip, but it's not going to work out today. But one example of that is internal enemies. Let me give you an example. The government was so scared of communism. Now, do you guys remember? What was the country in 1917 that went communist?
Russia.
The Russians, okay? And there was this fear in the 1920s called the Red Scare. Like, oh no, communism is like a disease. It's going to spread in. I mean, shoot, it was really bad. Even the Cincinnati Reds had to change their name. Anything red is not good. One example of this is called the Palmer Raids. And this was carried out by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. A. Mitchell Palmer had the idea to basically use the power of the government to go and arrest anybody who is a communist, anarchist, labor activist, or socialist. Anybody in these categories. Now, they didn't go after everybody, but they went to certain people, especially immigrants. And this is one of those examples where the government goes a little bit overboard, playing on the fears of people. It would be similar to after 9/11 if the government raided, what, Middle Eastern people? People that just happened to be Muslim, or that happened to be of a certain, it's like profiling, I guess. This is a great example of police terror. When it was all said and done, and a great example of injustice, more than 500 immigrants were sent back to their countries and thousands were jailed. Most of them had absolutely nothing to do with illegal activities. They just happened to be immigrants, maybe in the wrong place at the wrong place at the wrong time. And this is what's happening in the 1920s to good people who might be a little bit different, who might have different opinions, different political viewpoints. I mean, shoot, that just believe in certain things, like labor activists. What's the problem with that? These are people that believe that people should have a better job or a better wage. How is that in any way associated with communism? And even if it is, how much of a threat are those people to the stability of the United States? I mean, is the whole country going to fall apart? I mean, is Chicken Little here? Is the sky falling? You know what I'm saying? So here's a picture of the Palmer raids. And in one suspected raid, they're arresting some folks in Chicago. The word red becomes synonymous with danger, with bad. And one more example to talk about with the fear of communism, the fear of immigrants, is this very famous case, which is in your book, called the Sacco and Vanzetti case. You have Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants in Massachusetts, 1921, who were accused of killing a clerk south of Boston. They were put into custody and they were convicted of killing this person, and the jury only deliberated for about 2 hours, and then the verdict was very clear: send them to the electric chair. Well, a lot of people said, oh, wait a second, no, hold up now. This is wrong, we need to appeal this. And so many people, together with defense attorneys, started to lobby the government and actually took this case to appeal. And the evidence came out that these guys really didn't have anything to do with the murder. They were just there, and they happened to be Italian. And actually, here's the smoking gun, they actually happened to be anarchists. They hate government. Okay? It didn't matter though, because the Supreme Court still executed them in 1927, upholding the original verdict. Now, it's almost 100 years ago, and no new information has really come out, although there are lots of things that you can Google about these guys. Did they really have anything to do with this, or were they targeted simply for their ethnicity and their race? And that is something to think about in this climate of the United States at this time. So there's a little bit of the politics in the government. I'm actually going to end class here because I need to get to a certain place. I will not have these done by next Wednesday. I don't expect to. I will try though. Have a great weekend.
Where can I find your email?
What's that?
Your email?